Hello, I'm Larissa Coe, and we are going to talk about some story elements today. So, there are some important elements of every fictional story, but the first thing we need to define is fiction. Fiction is a piece of writing that is made up or imagined, as opposed to a true story told completely truthfully. The setting is the when and the where of the story. In order to get engaged, we want to know what we would be seeing if we were in the story. So, the setting tells us that where and when the story is taking place. Their characters are the people or creatures who act in the story. There are main characters, and the story centers around these characters. Main characters are usually dynamic, meaning that there's some kind of change in them from the beginning to the end. Whereas the minor characters are important because they help move the plot along, but they are not the focus, and generally they are static, meaning that they don't change from the beginning to the end of the story. The plot is just the sequence of events in a story. So when you're telling a story, this is the most important element because without things happening, it's really not a story. And we use a plot diagram to hash out how things happen. It looks kind of like this. You've probably seen it before. And it starts with the exposition, which is the part where we are introduced to the setting and some characters. Then it comes the conflict, which is a problem that gets the action and interest going. The majority of the story is the rising action portion. So this is a series of events that build suspense and lead to the climax, which is the point of highest suspense. During the climax, you really want to move on because you want to see this resolved. And at the end of the story, there is some kind of resolution, or at least falling action. And that is when some loose ends are tied up and questions are answered. And then last of all is the theme, which is an idea or message that runs through the story. I'm going to analyze the story Orpheus and Eurydice based on the video that I shared in the lesson of a storyteller telling the story through Hades' perspective. A lot of these myths and legends change based on the storyteller, so it's important to note the version that I'm going to be analyzing because these details might be different when you read different versions of the story. But for this one, we have our minor characters, Eurydice and Persephone. Now, you wouldn't think that Eurydice would be a minor character in a story called Orpheus and Eurydice, but if you think about it, she is a beautiful woman, a wood nymph. She's the first and only woman to catch Orpheus's attention, but she pretty much just walks silently behind him and dies. Those are the two things that she does. They're not very active. They don't say too much about her personality. So I would consider her a minor character for those reasons. You could argue with me on that, but I put her here and she is static. She doesn't change much because we don't even know who she is in the first place. She really is an important tool in the story for the action that takes place, but she herself doesn't have much depth in this version. Persephone is similar in that she's Hades' wife, and she seems touched by Orpheus's music. Hades kind of bounces ideas off of her, but she doesn't say anything herself. I do think maybe her role is that she humanizes Hades a bit. Without her in it, he would seem like less of a sympathetic character. But still, her role is static. We don't see changes in her from the beginning to the end of the story. And our main characters are Orpheus and Hades. So Orpheus is a mortal singer. He's not interested in most women and focused on music until Eurydice comes around. So that's the first big change, is that he falls in love and gets married. But then by the end of the story, he's hopeless and sad and not really trying to fall in love. He's not trying to get Eurydice anymore. We've seen that spark kind of go out in him. So even though it's a pretty sad change, it still is a change. And so he's a dynamic character. Hades is the god of the underworld, and he mentions not usually being merciful or making deals with mortals, but he's touched by the song of Orpheus, and he chooses to give Orpheus a chance. Hades doesn't ultimately let Eurydice go because she gets caught in the rules that he made, but you do see a slight change in him in that he sees himself as more of a softy, you could say, by the end. He's like, yeah, Orpheus changed my mind and not only made my life more interesting, but kind of made me think maybe I do care a little bit. So even though it's kind of a slight change, in this version, he is a dynamic character. And you'll notice in a lot of legends and myths, there is not a lot in the way of setting. So I Googled the time that this was first told, and it could have been told as early as 530 BC, but the time of the story itself is unclear. For places, we get a little bit about the underworld. We know that there are obstacles to get through, such as the three-headed dog, Cerberus, and we know there are souls of dead people, and Hades and his wife are down there. It's not described as a pleasant place, but there's not much description at all. So the setting descriptions are really lacking in this, but pay attention to other stories and you'll find the setting is often described in more detail and is more interesting. So next is the plot. This is the series of events that happened, and I just chose 12 events that happened. So to put these into a plot diagram, I suggest first laying out what happens like this, and then you can divide that up into the plot diagram like I did here. So in the exposition is the introduction and marriage. The inciting incident or the first conflict is when Eurydice dies. That's when the story gets interesting. And then is the rising action. A few different things happen. Orpheus sings a couple times, goes to the underworld, makes the deal with Hades, and starts walking out of the underworld. The climax, you could argue with me on this one as well. I say the climax is when Orpheus is walking out and trying not to look at Eurydice. I can just imagine the gravity of the moment and all that matters, and also the fear. Like he just made it to the underworld, made a deal with the devil, kind of, the non-devil god. And now all of his future happiness lies on him not looking back to check if she's there. I think that's the most suspenseful moment, and it's described in a way that really makes you feel it. So that is the plot. Usually you start looking into the theme after you've looked at all of these other things, because the theme is ultimately the message that the author is trying to get across. Part of the fun of a theme is that usually there are many, and it's sort of up for interpretation. Kind of like if you look at a painting, people like to really think about what it means, what the painter was trying to say. Same thing with stories. Even stories in our daily life that aren't fiction, we kind of look for meanings in them. And that's just one of the great things about being human, is trying to find messages in things that happen, whether they're real or unreal. So I went kind of overboard with the themes for this story because I wanted to give you a lot of examples. Sometimes people are taught that the theme is a topic, like love or hate, or at a party, the 1960s could be the theme of the party. But when we're looking into analysis, at least in this class, I want you to find a complete thought as the theme. So I wrote several for you here. First one, love brings the greatest joy and sorrow that life has to give. Trust in your partner can be the difference between being together and apart. People tend to want the things that they can't have. Not even godly power, popularity, or amazing talent will save you from tragedy. If you never learn to forgive yourself, you will live a miserable life. And loyal lovers never truly move on. So these are pretty different messages, and maybe when you were reading it, one of these stood out to you. Maybe some of these seem ridiculous. And I think that's great. That's one of the fun things about watching or reading stories that other people watch or read, so you can see how other people come to conclusions about the same story, which is pretty fun to see. Whatever the case, each of these is more than just a phrase like trust in your partner or forgive yourself. It's a little bit more complex than that, but also it's not so specific that I'm telling the story. So it's not like if you sing a lullaby to Cerberus, then you can get past him. It's not anything like that. So you want to be somewhere between super general and cliche and super specific to things that don't really apply outside of the story. This may be a review for you, but hopefully you learned something new or had a nice refresher about some of these concepts that we'll be using throughout the course. And until next lesson, thank you for watching.